All right. I hit go live.
I see us on VECINA.
Okay, awesome. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lindsay Gray, and I am here with Kate Lincoln-Goldfinch. I'm the CEO of VECINA. Kate is the managing partner of Lincoln-Goldfinch Law and is also the VECINA board president. Woo! We are here. We are here this morning. Apparently, still so happy that I can't even speak straight about the declaration for a new administration coming in 2021. And we are here to talk today about what that means for immigration in the first 100 days. So Kate and I are going to go off of a document. So if you see my eyes moving to the left, or maybe it's your right, it's because I'm reading through a document for that the Biden administration has published about the things that they plan to do in the first 100 days. That document also contains policy propositions related to things that they intend to try to get done with Congress, as well as some more humanitarian and welcoming efforts for immigrants that we're not going to talk about today, but we will post the link after the video is done so that if you want to go back and look at that stuff, you are welcome to. So thank you, Kate, so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I was just figuring out how to share this on my own pages, but I think I got it done. So
awesome. I think I just saw it pop up. So all right. So the first thing that the Biden administration says that they'll do in the first 100 days is immediately reverse the Trump administration's cruel and senseless policies that separate parents from their children at our border. Now, Kate, you were really involved in this in 2018 with the rise of family separation. What do you think that that might look like as the Biden administration works to end family separation?
right. Well, as we all know, there was this massive program of separating families during the summer of 2018. And this was all, we're going to talk about the metering and all of that because it's all sort of, interconnected. The Trump administration said, okay, we're going to block the ports of entry for asylum seekers, and then we're going to prosecute anyone who enters without status under the zero tolerance policy. And then we're going to use that prosecution as an excuse to separate the families. And so that led to over 3,000 separations. And I get goosebumps just talking about it because it was the most horrific, awful thing I've ever experienced as an immigration lawyer. And I was working with mothers in the Hutto Detention Center whose children had been taken from them that whole summer of 2018. Little kids. And at the time that we started meeting with the moms, they hadn't seen their children. They didn't even know where they were, and it had been like a month at that point. And so throughout the course of the summer, they got to know where their kids were and maybe sometimes communicate with their children who had been sent all over the country. And I know we all heard about it. And then I think because of the public outcry and litigation, the sort of 1-2 punch, the official zero tolerance program of family separations was forced to end. But since then, even though there's not this like blanket across, all people policy of family separations, there still are, I think, case by case situations where a border patrol agent can, call into a question a birth certificate, or they may decide like there's no proof that this is a family relationship. And I just think that this is a, trafficker bringing a child in based on many times like no evidence at all, or it can be a situation where it's like a grandmother raising a child because maybe one of the parents has passed away, or an aunt or an uncle, or even I've seen siblings, older sisters bringing their I remember this girl I met with who she was an indigenous Mexican, and she was like 18 years old, and her parents had been murdered. And so she had raised her young brother, and he was under 18 and she had just turned 18, and they separated those two and put him, in an unaccompanied minor facility. And then the girl, she's 18, so she's technically an adult, was in like adult detention. So there are still case by case separations of families. And so what I read this to mean is that, as an agency, family separations are not going to be implemented at all, and so I don't know if you agree with me on that, Lindsay, or not.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely think that that's very likely. I've also seen that the Biden administration plans to put together a task force to try to reunify the family members that are still separated. I think there was recent publication of that there are upwards of 545 children that are still separated from their parents. And I did an interview a week or two back with Amy Maldonado, who does a lot of that litigation work. And what she had mentioned was that the government is really not prioritizing the reunification of these kids, of course, because they sought to separate them in the first place. And so I think that the task force will work to put in investigative measures, right, to try to also get these kids that are still separated unified.
And I think that brings up an interesting point about the family separations that was so shocking to all of us, is that there wasn't a plan put in place to track the separated families. It was like the kids just were sent into the unaccompanied minor system, the parents were sent into the adult system, and there was no like even software program that was responsible for keeping those two cases connected. They were just separated and sent to different parts of the country, and no one was responsible for tracking them. I mean, it's just it blows the mind. But so I'm so happy, to see that someone's going to put an effort, because in many of these cases, probably these parents were deported and their children were left in shelter.
Oh yeah, I would think that that is where we stand quite, maybe at the majority of time at this point. All right, so switching gears a little bit, the next one is that the Biden administration plans to do in the first 100 days is end Trump's detrimental asylum policies, which is a whole can of worms. But let's start with what they plan to start with, is to end the migrant protection protocols. Now, working with asylum seekers subject to the migrant protection protocols is what VECINA focuses on at this point. And that's for asylum seekers who have come to the border, said, I'd like to seek asylum, and they were given a notice to appear and sent back to Mexico to await their United States court hearing, but they're not allowed to live here. They have to live in Mexico, which has required many of them, thousands of them, to live in basically refugee camps in unsafe living conditions without access to, adequate employment, shelter, food, things of that nature. And so he does plan to end that policy. And Kate, can he do that by executive order?
Sure, it was implemented by executive order, and I visited one of the camps, and I know you did too, Lindsay, last year at the end of the year. And I was, after family separations, it was the thing that got me. I was there with a couple of colleagues who were also experienced immigration lawyers, and we were just like sobbing as we walked through the camps, because, a refugee camp, like a UN refugee camp, has support from, the Red Cross and NGOs that come in and provide medical care and housing and other shelter and food and school clothing, necessities. But these so-called refugee camps under the MPP program had none of that governmental or NGO support. All they had was volunteers, and this amazing group of volunteers from lots of different organizations that took on the responsibility of providing the medical care and providing the food to these families living in these camps. And a lot of that got, halted during COVID. And it's really, these families are living in really squalid conditions. I mean, in many cases, like they work an entire day just to get enough money to charge their cell phone. And I have pictures of like the cell phone charging stations, like, hundreds of phones on this one pole, and so, and the thing that, MPP has got to end. I mean, it is abhorrent as a policy. The United States recognized our responsibility to protect refugees fleeing persecution after World War II, when we failed as a nation to do that. And so we've signed on for over 70 years to international treaties, and we codified our laws about asylum over 40 years ago. And the number one rule of asylum, as written in the laws that Congress wrote 40 years ago, is that you have to be here. You have to be in our country, and it doesn't matter how you got here, whether you had a visa or not. And so getting us back to that point of who we are as a country, I think, is so critical. But the hard part about it is now we've had MPP in place for over a year. And so that means that we actually have tens of thousands of asylum seekers who are in Mexico wanting to come here for protection. And so how that process of allowing them in to process through our asylum system, which I just want to say, wasn't broken. I mean, there were areas that needed to be fixed, but we had the system in place that was functional for decades, where asylum seekers come to our border. They go through what's called a credible fear interview, where if they can show an asylum officer that based on what happened to them, they might qualify for asylum, they come in, they get out of detention, they get a work permit, they prepare for their final hearing, which is this long hearing with a lawyer, with evidence, with experts sometimes. And contrary to what Trump said in one of the debates, it is not people with a low IQ who show up for their hearing. It's people who pass their credible fear interview and who have a chance of winning their asylum case. And if they don't come, they get deported. So of course they want to come. In fact, more than 90% of asylum seekers who are released from detention after passing a credible fear interview, they show up for their hearings. And so I just want to like hammer this home that we are not talking about hordes of law-breaking people who abscond and don't show up for their hearings. That is false. That is a false narrative. Asylum seekers, by and large, want to follow the laws. They want to come to their court hearings. They want to do things the right way, and they just want to work and protect their families. And our economy needs them, honestly.
For sure. I want to go back to something you mentioned a couple of times, which was work authorization. And so, generally people who apply for asylum, once their asylum case has been pending for 180 days, they're eligible for work authorization. But the Trump administration, that's another sort of probably detrimental policy, is that there's a new regulation that changes that. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, like you referenced a can of worms. Like these are these are the worms you have to like pull out. Like it's just been one thing after the other. And we were talking about like, oh, it's gonna be so fun to have like one thing after the other, but for the positive, like the next 4 years are gonna be so much more fun. But there were several, executive actions implemented recently in August about work permission eligibility for asylum seekers. And for a long time, asylum seekers don't just come in and get a work permit. There has been a waiting period of 6 months, which in my opinion is too long. I think asylum seekers need to be able to work. But so there were lots of restrictions placed, like if you enter without inspection or you don't file for asylum within 1 year of your entry, then you just don't qualify for a work permit anymore. And so that's going to be another big, I think, change and positive impact on asylum seekers.
For sure. And another thing that they mention is, I apologize, I'm reading the document. So additional restrictions on anyone traveling through Mexico or Guatemala. Mm-hmm. So this, I believe, is what's referred to as the third country ban. And so it prohibited people who had passed through one of those countries on their way to the U.S. And prohibited them from applying to asylum once they got here and got sent back. And so, do you think that those will just go away? And I guess there's also another policy, where these safe third country agreements with certain countries where people can get sent to those countries as an alternative. Do you want to talk about both of those things?
Yeah. These are like Trump has been, I almost hate using this word in reference to him, but so successful in eviscerating asylum eligibility for people. And really, I think it was Stephen Miller. And they've just been throwing these policies at the wall to see what sticks. And many of them have been enjoined in the federal court system, like the first asylum ban, which said you don't qualify for asylum if you don't enter with inspection, if you enter through the border. Which of course is contrary to the main asylum statute, and the president doesn't have authority to do that. But some of the ones that have so far stuck are this transit ban, which says that if an asylum seeker passes through any other country on their journey to the United States, then they must apply for asylum in that country. And so that's most asylum seekers, with the exception of people who already had visas to come to the United States and they fly directly here. And so as with many of the Trump policies, we've all immigration lawyers have had sort of whiplash as these cases get bounced around in federal court where, they're enjoined, like the public charge rule is a perfect example.
I know, I was just thinking that same thing.
But the transit ban, was enjoined and then it wasn't, and then it was. And so the latest has been that it wasn't, I think. I'm not even sure what the latest update is, but basically
it isn't joined currently, I think.
It is. So it's really like, if you think about Cubans, Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, these are people who are coming from countries where it's, many of them are being persecuted by their own government. They have strong eligibility for asylum, and yet they have to travel through other countries on their journey here, and it's not safe for them to apply for asylum in El Salvador, in Honduras. They can't have safety there, and so it's just absurd, this idea that they have to apply for asylum at all the countries that they travel through. So I'm really, for one, really happy to see that policy ending.
Yes, for sure. And then the last thing I think in this particular point that they talk about is making it more difficult for LGBTQ asylum seekers, victims of domestic violence, and victims of gang activity to obtain asylum. I know in 2018, there was a case called Matter of AB that is from the Board of Immigration Appeals, but the Board of Immigration Appeals, right, not quite. The Attorney General, then Attorney General Jeff Sessions, handpicked a case from the Board of Immigration Appeals and referred it to himself so that he could decide that in that particular case, it was more narrow, but he had a lot of moments where he said, well, victims of domestic violence generally don't qualify for asylum, and they're trying to codify this. And that's in a proposed regulation. And so do we anticipate that that there obviously that those proposed regulations will be thrown out, but then I'll be curious to see if whoever's appointed acting attorney general will, pick another case to sort of switch it back.
Do you that same decision? I mean, and I think that this really highlights like the absurdity of the immigration court system, which I often give presentations to lawyers who are not immigration lawyers, and they are all shocked to learn that the immigration court system, including the immigration judges, the first level court system, plus the Board of Immigration Appeals, are actually housed in the Department of Justice, meaning it's an executive branch entity that is controlled and governed by the Attorney General and the President, and that the Attorney General, who supervises and appoints the immigration judges and the prosecutors, is able to pluck out a case from the immigration court system and certify it to himself. And I say himself because it's been men recently, and issue a precedential decision, just completely, changing policy for immigrants in the court system. And that's not the way our government is supposed to function. The judicial branch is supposed to be independent of the executive branch, but that's not true in the immigration court system. And so this is one of the things, this is like immigration lawyers are talking about all the time. It's like when we talk about what are the major changes that need to happen, is that the immigration court system needs to be removed from the executive branch. I mean, that obviously is going to have to take an act of Congress. It's not something that Biden can just do. But until that happens, under a Biden administration, his appointed attorney general would have the same authority to rescind decisions that Jeff Sessions may have issued. And again, these were decisions that were made during the Trump administrations that completely changed the last 40 years of intricate developed case law about asylum eligibility. There's a whole vast body of case law that guides us about who is eligible and who isn't. And the idea that one attorney general can just go in and just drop a bomb on it is absurd. And so I'm hopeful that our new AG will sort of backpedal some of the stuff that the attorneys general under Trump implemented.
For sure. The next point is about ending the mismanagement of asylum system, which fuels violence and chaos at the border. And they specifically note metering. Now, we've talked about MPP, but we haven't talked about metering. What is metering?
So metering was the precursor to family detentions, because the way that it's worked for decades is that asylum seekers come to our border, and they come to the bridge and they ask for asylum, and they say, I'm from Honduras and I've been persecuted and I need protection. And we process them in. We don't just let them in. Typically, they actually have to go into a detention center, which I don't agree with, but this has been the process. They go into detention and they go through this credible fear interview. And if they pass, they get released, they get work permission. And if they fail, they get deported after one appeal option. The system was not a broken one, but what we saw, rather than a huge increase in migrants seeking asylum, there were some, upticks in the numbers. we saw a real shift in the population. So because of the violence in the Northern Triangle, the children are the most vulnerable to the gangs. So people, instead of leaving, their children in the care of a grandparent, if they're fleeing, we would see unaccompanied minors or family units coming. And so that really changed the population, the landscape of asylum seekers. And so rather than thinking about, well, instead of detaining these families or building more detention centers, let's think about the needs and the ways to support the processing of asylum seeking families. What the Trump administration did was say, okay, we're just going to stop processing. So what we're going to do is put Border Patrol officers on the bridge, like before the port of entry, and they're going to meter people who are coming to seek asylum, and we're going to check their documentation before they even get to the port of entry, and we're going to just halt the processing. We're just going to say, like, we're only going to process 10 asylum seekers at the Laredo Bridge today, and everybody else, too bad, so sad, you stay in Mexico. So then, of course, what people do, because they're also not safe, many of them in Mexico, is then they make the decision, the very difficult decision in many cases, to cross or to enter without inspection, through the river or through the desert. And then that's when zero tolerance, prosecution started and the family separations. But the idea of metering is deciding not to process asylum seekers who are trying to do everything the right way and come to the border and ask for help,
Yeah, for sure. And I was at two different ports of entry during the time that metering was really in full force. And one was in Tijuana, which is at the San Diego border. And then another was in Matamoros, which is at the Harlingen border in Texas. So opposite ends of our border. And what was really interesting is, the development of what they call the list. So people, they get metered and turned back. And so then there was this question of, well, who gets to go? If they're only processing 10 a day, who gets to go? And, in Tijuana, it was actually, the list was run largely by the migrants, but there was a lot of bribery or allegations of bribery or, corruptness that was going on among the migrants. But that wasn't as bad as Matamoros, which was, the list was run by, Mexican government / the gangs. And so, there was bribery going on there, but in a little bit more of an ominous kind of way. And so then, someone will say, well, I'm number 35, but somehow it's been, 12 days and they haven't gotten to me yet. And so, because people were jumping up on the list. And so it was a very disheartening experience, I think, for many people. And so I'll be very glad to see that end.
And I just want to say too, I mean, the cartels have really seized upon the opportunity to kidnap these migrants. I mean, I think, for those of us who are in the United States and we're not working on these issues, it's like, I think out of sight, out of mind, really. The family separations were one thing, but then when the metering starts and the families are in Mexico, it's easy to just sort of lose sight of what's happening. But the truth of it is that the cartels have initiated these, like, really developed networks of kidnapping and holding people for ransom. So what happens is, people are metered or they're sent back, and it's obvious who the migrants are, right? Like the cartels know who they are. And they'll immediately go pick them up and hold them for ransom. They take the cell phone and they call the family members in the United States and they demand, between $4,000 and $6,000 per person. And I've worked with lots of families subject to MPP who have been kidnapped and released. I mean, it's very, very common. And of course, we're talking about families with children, with young girls, and you can imagine what might happen to them when they're being held in a cartel house waiting for their ransom to be paid. So it really is policy, the metering, the MPP, sending vulnerable migrants anywhere but into safety has got to stop immediately. And so I'm so glad to hear that it's on Biden's, first 100 days list, because it really, really needs to end.
Yeah, the conditions at the border. I mean, I know, attorneys, for example, another thing that this brings up, that we could go on and on about is the access to counsel issue that is created by people being required to stay south of the border. I mean, you have some nonprofits along the border that do everything that they can and they work day and night. But there are some places like at the Laredo port of entry where it's really not safe to cross. And so, a lot of that, the legal counsel is being done via WhatsApp, which is just not a way you do what you can, but it's not a sustainable way to practice law or to receive counsel, especially when you've been the victim of really serious trauma. And another thing about MPP also with the kidnappings is that, in order to be processed into the US for your hearing, which often takes place in what's called a port court or a tent court, which is a shipping container, is that you have to show up at the bridge at like 4 o'clock in the morning, which means that if you don't live right by the bridge, you are traveling in the dark in the middle of the night. And I know a lot of kidnappings happen then. And so just a really, really horrible situation. So they are also on a proactive note. The next thing that the Biden administration said that they will do in their first 100 days is to surge humanitarian resources to the border and foster public and private initiatives. So I guess when they're saying that they're going to end MPP and end metering, there's tens of thousands, as you mentioned, Kate, on the south of the border that would then need to be processed into the United States. Now, whether they end up in detention for a short or prolonged period of time, I guess we'll get to that in a moment, or if they end up going out, that's going to take a lot of resources. So do we have any idea what that's going to look like at this point, or are we going to watch it unfold in the coming days and weeks?
I think both. I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of watching, and it'll be really interesting to see how they do it. I don't think it's likely that they're going to just invite everyone in. Like we were talking about right before starting this meeting, it's probably going to be like a, stair step, like people will be brought in as groups. But I mean, as I mentioned earlier, asylum seekers, the vast majority of asylum seekers do not abscond. And so what I see in the Biden plan is a recognition that this sort of community support works better than detention. In fact, I think was it during the Obama administration? It was during the Obama administration, they ran a program where instead of detaining asylum seekers, they gave them case management support, where they had someone to call to ask, where do I need to go for my ICE check-in? How do I update my address with the court? How do I get to court? It's like they had support and guidance rather than detention or ankle monitoring. And 99% of the participants in that pilot program showed up for court. And then nothing happened. They didn't implement it. And what I'm going to say is that we've built this vast network of private prisons along our southern border that are highly, highly lucrative for the private prison industry. I mean, we're talking about billions of dollars a year that this industry earns. And so as a result, they have strong lobbies and they, impact, I think, policy and legislation. So what I'm hopeful in reading that point of this plan is that this is a recognition that detention is too expensive, it's unnecessary. And so instead of that, we can provide shelters, housing support, community support, guidance on how to comply with all of the requirements that are placed upon an asylum seeker. And we'll see really good results from that. And we won't be spending billions of taxpayer dollars on unnecessary detention of immigrants.
Yeah. That sounds really good.
Yeah.
I hope that happens. And that kind of goes to their next point, which says they plan to end prolonged detention and reinvest in a case management program. So It sounds like maybe they will be implementing that. They say, as you just mentioned, that evidence shows that these programs are highly effective and far less expensive than prolonged detention. And so here's hoping.
I know we like the writing of the plan. We want to see it in action, but we like it.
And the next one, sort of shifting away from asylum and the border for a moment, is to reverse the public charge rule. So the public charge rule, when someone applies for a green card, they have to be unlikely to become a public charge, right? Which means generally that they're unlikely to have to rely on the government for financial assistance. Right. But what that means, right, is, depends. And so what used to happen is we filled out a form called an I-864, and that was a form that was done by the petitioner, the person requesting that their family member be granted a green card. So the U.S. citizen spouse or the U.S. citizen child, or not child, but adult child. But if that person didn't make enough money, you could get what's called a joint sponsor, right? And that person had to show all of their tax returns and verify that they would make sure and support the person. And the government could go after that petitioner or joint sponsor if, in fact, the beneficiary or the new green card holder sought government benefits. But
Right.
the Trump administration has sort of deemed that not to be enough and has instituted a new public charge rule, which requires a lot more. So do you want to talk just briefly about that? Because I know we could go on and on. And so we sort of know what's likely to get reversed.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I want to say about the public charge is it was based on a completely false premise, which is that immigrants, undocumented immigrants, are receiving public benefits. And the first thing to note is that federal, means tested public benefits aren't available to undocumented immigrants. They can't get them. They might be able to get like free lunch in school, but they can't get, federal means tested benefits. Sorry, my puppy is being a little wild right now. So in February, the implementation happened. This is another one of these policies that's been bounced around. I can't even tell you guys, like 6 times in the last 2 months. It's been on, it's been back off, it's been on. It's just been exhausting. But the actual impact of the public charge rule is that in preparing a green card application, there's this added part of the application that looks at the applicant's financial situation, but like their whole history, their skills, their education, their credit score. It's like adding a mortgage application on top of a green card application. I mean, our applications went from maybe a couple 100, 200 pages to 500 pages, so just from a like practical standpoint, it's just a lot of unnecessary work that's based on a really false premise. But I would say the worst part about public charge has been the chilling effect that it has had on immigrant parents who have canceled benefits for their U.S. citizen children, like CHIP, like TANF, food support, insurance support. I mean, the applications for those benefits for children, we're talking about U.S. citizen children, who are now not getting the food that they need. They're not getting the medical care that they need because Trump put this policy into place that just terrified immigrant families. And that's been the saddest part for me to witness, not the hassle of preparing the application, which is annoying, but the impact that the policy has had on immigrant families has been, it's difficult to like even state, how awful the impact has been of this policy, just because of the fear that it has instilled in the immigrant community. So I'm so excited for it to go away, mostly for that reason than any other.
Definitely. The next thing they said that they're going to do is end the so-called national emergency that siphons federal dollars from the Department of Defense to build a wall. I heard Biden say recently that he will not build another inch of wall. And so I don't know if there needs to be much said about that, but that, one of VECINA's taglines is that we're building bridges, not walls. Yeah. And so we're stoked about that.
No and disaster relief is necessary, especially in, this time with climate change. We are going to need more and more of it. So taking that money away from Puerto Rico to build a wall, bad idea. So happy to hear about that.
And the next thing is to protect dreamers and their families. So I want to stay away from the legislative possibility, the green card getting, or I should mention, I guess, maybe not stay away from it, that in order to create a pathway to citizenship, to permanent residency and citizenship for dreamers and their families, Biden would need to work with Congress to get that done because it would require a legislative act. However, much DACA itself was implemented through executive order by President Obama. So let's talk a little bit about what that might look like, or what the current state of DACA is, and how it might change.
Okay. So as we're talking about hundreds of thousands of young people, they're not kids because many of them are adults now, who, graduated or got a GED, don't have a criminal history. At this point, they've had DACA for 8 years, many of them. So they've graduated from college, they've got professional jobs, maybe have families. And it's a vital program for this group of people and their families and their employers. And so, of course, we know that Trump tried to cancel it. It was wrapped up in litigation for several years, and the Supreme Court just this year announced that the way that Trump had canceled the program was unlawful. And so they required the program to continue. The unfortunate part of that is that the Trump administration has not followed the Supreme Court decision, and in total violation of federal court order have said we're not processing initial applications, so people who qualify for DACA but never applied. We're only going to do renewals, and we're going to shorten the length of time of work permit eligibility. And then we're not going to allow advanced parole, which is a travel permission for DACA recipients that can be very beneficial in a lot of ways. So I think we were all sort of waiting on the election to see what was going to happen with forcing Trump to follow the Supreme Court order. And so this is one of the things I'm most excited about. And I think we can see really quick action from Biden on this because it's executive order. So I think he can immediately reopen DACA, expand eligibility for all of these young people who may not have been able to apply or didn't qualify before. So we're going to see more DACA eligible recipients. We're going to see more renewals happening, travel possibilities. And it's like, this is going to be one of these like complete celebratory moments for this group of people. And I can't wait. I can't wait for the DACA change.
Yeah, and another thing that they mentioned on their website is that that they do plan to explore legal options for DACA recipients' families, so their parents specifically, and that they want to make sure that DACA recipients qualify for federal financial aid for colleges and universities, which would be fantastic.
Yes.
The next thing they say they're going to do is to rescind the travel and refugee bans that are commonly referred to as the Muslim bans. Right. So this harkened way back, I think, to 2017, right?
No, this is like the first, this is like January.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is the first thing that happened, and we had like 1.0, 2.0. I think we got 3.0. And so they're planning to rescind those. I mean, I think there may be some travel restrictions generally still in place because of COVID, right? But it sounds like they plan to take all of these off the table.
Yeah, and for me and my immigration practice, we do mostly family-based immigration, and I have seen, I don't know how many families who have been under a forced separation because of these travel bans. So they may have a parent or a spouse or a child who's here in the U.S. and wants to bring them from one of these prohibited countries, and it hasn't been possible with these travel bans. So I'm excited about all the families that get to reunite with the rescission of this travel ban. And again, I think this will be a quick one that comes really fast.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's right. Then the next thing they say is that they're going to order an immediate review of temporary protected status, commonly referred to as TPS, for vulnerable populations. The Trump administration, from my understanding, has ordered rescission of TPS for many countries. Much of that has been enjoined by court order, but the TPS recipients are now sort of living in limbo, and it sounds like they're going to review and potentially reinstate several of those, and maybe add some more.
I mean, this is one that they need to take really fast action on, because this is another bounced all over the place kind of policies. And Trump canceled TPS for El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Nepal in 2017. And all of these people, hundreds of thousands of people, like 400,000 people, have been in limbo as this case plays out in the court system. And the latest development on this is that the Ninth Circuit allowed the cancellation last month. And so up until the election, the state of affairs for TPS holders from Honduras and Nicaragua and Nepal has been they're expecting their cancellation in January. And then for El Salvador, it's next September. And it's been, these TPS is a program that's available to people who are in the United States when there's some type of infrastructure collapse in their country. And for El Salvador and Honduras, it was based on these horrible hurricanes that happen. And so people with TPS who have been here from those countries at this point have been here for 2 decades. And so many of them have raised children, they've bought homes, they've started businesses. And they're very established here. And to qualify for TPS, you can't have a serious criminal history. So they're also just like contributing a lot. They're paying their taxes. These are people we want here. And so it's similar, it's just very similar to DACA, that like the possibility that this population doesn't have to live in fear. And let me also mention that back to the craziness of the immigration court system, it was backlogged and overloaded before the Trump administration, like 800,000 cases pending. It could take years to get through the immigration court system. And when you talk about Trump canceling DACA and TPS, that adds more than double the amount of cases to the court system, because the president doesn't have the authority to just cancel someone's work permit and then pick them up and deport them. They have the right to defend themselves in immigration court. And there's lots of defenses available to people, but adding this whole bucket of hundreds of thousands or over 1 million people into the already overwhelmed court system is just insane. When you're talking about, these are people that we want here. Nobody wants to deport. Well, I shouldn't say nobody, but if you're thinking clearly, you do not want to deport these populations of people.
Yeah, and sort of to go along those lines, they do mention at the end of that little blurb in their document that they plan to work again with Congress to try to find a pathway to citizenship for TPS recipients as well. And going sort of, again, you touched on their next point, which is to restore sensible enforcement priorities. So we're talking about the backlogged immigration court system. Now, under President Obama, he issued this memo that we, I guess, often refer to as the enforcement priorities memo, which sort of lays out the enforcement priorities. If you have a serious felony, you're in category 1. And what they had decided at that point, that anyone that was in category 3, which was, I think they didn't have, do you remember exactly? Gosh, it's been so long since it was actually in place.
No recent immigration violations and no significant criminal history, no violent criminal history. Basically the undocumented person who was here many years ago before the borders became less porous and has lived and, raised their family in the US without causing any trouble.
Right. And they've lived here for a certain period of time. I think it was the memo went into effect in 2014, and then they had to prove that they'd been here, I think, since 2010. And so, yeah, I mean, hopefully something like that. And then we as immigration attorneys could petition, if they were in deportation proceedings, we could petition for them to close their case, which doesn't give them any status, but at least doesn't put them in the position where the government is actively trying to deport them. And so this makes sense, right? When we have an immigration court backlog of years and years, to allow the folks who have not, committed any serious criminal or immigration violations to remain here, for a period of time, and hopefully eventually they would end up qualifying for some kind of status.
Yeah, I mean, if you're thinking about, this is an agency that doesn't have the capacity to enforce, to round up and deport all the undocumented people, nor do we want them to. That would be very harmful for our economy. And the court system, as I mentioned, is overburdened. And so it only makes sense that an administration would say, these are our priorities. And obviously the people who are a danger should be the priorities, and everybody else, let's not spend our resources on them right now. So it just makes sense. And then one of the first actions that Trump took was just revoking priorities. And so now everyone's a priority. And what that means in practical application, and I can tell you with, working with lots of clients over the last few years, is that anyone who gets apprehended, gets detained, gets, stays in detention, and many get deported. And, we're talking about people who might get pulled over in Bastrop for driving without a license, or in rural areas where they're getting picked up, not for committing, a crime necessarily. They're getting racially profiled and put into deportation proceedings. And I have so many sad stories of people who have families, don't have a criminal history, and anyone looking at them and learning their story would want them to be able to stay, but they, got deported because there were no prior enforcement priorities. So it's going to be another good one, another really good, long needed change.
Yes. And then the next one is to ensure that Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and Customs and Border Protection, CBP, personnel abide by professional standards and are held accountable for inhumane treatment. I'm not sure that a whole lot needs to be said about that, but we're so happy that maybe somebody's going to oversee the treatment of migrant children from victims of abuse and trauma as they enter our country.
I mean, the only thing I'll say about that is there are human beings who are working in these agencies, right? And then there are some people who, based on the stories I've heard, view migrants as like cockroaches to be squashed. And the way that they treat them is abhorrent. And without a leader in office telling those agents, you can't behave that way, or otherwise you won't be a part of this agency, they run rampant because they have this, sort of unquestionable power and authority to treat people how they wish to. And unless you have the leadership in place controlling that behavior, you're going to see what we've seen over the last few years. So it absolutely has to be said.
Yes, no, I agree. It definitely has to be said. It's sad it has to be said, but we're glad it is being said. Um, yeah. So the next one is protect and expand opportunities for people who risk their lives in military service. And so, one of the things they say is to create a parole process for veterans who sadly were deported under this administration, and also not targeting men and women who served in uniforms or their families. So do we have any idea what this will look like?
Well, I mean, I think, there's been this program, the Parole in Place program, where immediate relatives of people who have served in the military can go through a simpler process to get status and get protection from deportation. And the Trump administration has made an attempt or a threat to cancel that program multiple times, and have, actually deported people who have served in the military. And so this is just, I think, a reiteration and recognition that we respect our troops and we honor their sacrifices, and we're not going to deport their family members when they've given us so much. And so again, it's like one of these things that really this has to be said, but apparently it does. And so I'm glad they're saying it.
Right. And then the next thing they say is they're going to restore and defend the naturalization process for green card holders. So a couple of the things that we were talking about before we went live was the fee increase that this administration was trying to increase the fee for the naturalization process quite drastically. Right. And then also that there had been a significant backlog of naturalization applications. What do you think that, this will come to play out in practice as in terms of changes?
Well, there was a sort of across the board filing fee increase that, as you mentioned, had a really significant, it was like over $500 just to apply for citizenship. So I think we can count on that not happening now. Which
$500 additional dollars.
Additional dollars, right? So it's over $1,000 to apply for citizenship. And locally, we have seen about a doubling in the processing timeline on citizenship cases. Like pre-Trump, it would take about 6 months from start to finish, and under Trump, it's taken a year plus. But those processing times can vary by jurisdiction, so it's much longer in other places. And so again, it's one of these things where if the leader of the agency, the people who process citizenship cases are part of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security, which of course is run by the DHS secretary, who is appointed by the president. And if the leadership doesn't give a flip about how many new U.S. citizens we're swearing in and is not putting any pressure all the way down on getting these cases done quickly, what we see is what we've seen, which is everything just slows down. And so I read this as a recognition that it is a priority to process these cases. And so we're going to get to see processing times pick back up, which will make a lot of my clients really happy.
For sure. We're looking forward to that. And then the second to last, we just have two more out of I don't know how many it's been. It's been many.
We're not even touching on what Congress could do.
I know. So the second to last one is to revitalize the task force on new Americans and boost our economy by prioritizing integration, promoting immigrant entrepreneurship, increasing access to language instruction, and promoting civil engagement. So yeah, the talents of new immigrants integrating the talents of new immigrants into our community and helping them thrive enriches our nation and our economy, which is certainly true. So I'm looking forward to that. That seems this particular point seems slightly less legal. I know that, other aspects of this in terms of work-based visas and things of that nature, he's hoping to revamp. But in terms of the first 100 days, it sounds like this is sort of getting us all on board with the fact that especially highly skilled, highly educated immigrants offer something very, very important to our society, as do all immigrants. But this particular subset is about, students and entrepreneurs.
Yeah, which is really exciting. And also just like a rhetoric shift, from
Yeah,
xenophobic, like immigrants bad, to like what we all know, which is that America is a land of immigrants and diversity is what makes us who we are. And it makes our country beautiful. And so now to have someone in charge of all of this that says that and believes that, it gives me goosebumps just saying it. Like it's kind of so sad that even that, basic idea makes me feel that way. But I mean, that's what I hear when I read that.
yeah, for sure. And then the last one they say that they will do is convene a regional meeting of leaders, including from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, and Canada, to address the factors driving migration and to propose a regional resettlement solution. So one of the things that I think did happen, if I'm not remembering correctly, is that the current administration took away quite a bit of funding, federal aid, to other countries that were driving some of the migration to the United States. And it sounds like not necessarily that the new administration will just dump a bunch of money, but that there will be a dialogue about what can be done, maybe to help people. Nobody wants to leave their home. Very few, I should say, want to leave their home, and the vast majority of people leaving are fleeing violence and torture, and a fear for their lives, basically.
Exactly. I mean, I think that needs to be said because, of course there are immigrants who, like the students, the entrepreneurs who want to come here, they come after the American dream, but most of the asylum seekers are people who are fleeing persecution. And we have a lot of asylum seekers from the Northern Triangle of Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And these countries are being controlled right now by the cartels. And most of the families that I've met, the people that I've met, never wanted to leave. They were pushed out. And, that's when you hear people talk about like the push factors. And so, of course, any wise leader is going to think about how to handle the people who are coming to our border in a humanitarian way, but are also going to take a step back and take a macro perspective of all this, or what are these push factors and how can we as a country help El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, in a way that doesn't take over those countries ourselves, of course, but in a way to help them get to the point where their people don't need to flee. And I was 2 years ago, I went to the Bush Institute, President Bush's institute, and he conducted a roundtable conversation specifically about this issue of resolving the push factors. And I thought, gosh, it's so nice to see a leader thinking about these issues and talking about these issues. And because we're never going to stop the flow of asylum seekers, but if we start thinking about how to help our neighboring countries, that's going to be the biggest impact, I think. It's not going to be threatening to take people's kids away from them or putting them into detention centers. It's going to be spending that same amount of money that we might have spent on enforcement and instead using it to help people and help our neighboring countries. And that's when we start to see like real long-lasting resolution.
I agree. And I just want to point out that the vecina means neighbor in Spanish. And so we're very excited about anything such as this where we can help out our neighbors. So Kate, I think that's all they have in the document. So thank you so much for this. I know for everyone that either is watching now or will be watching later, this was quite long, but we're very excited about all of the numerous possible changes coming up. And so thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for watching, guys.
Yep. Bye.